Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football. This Oregon Ducks team heading into 2023 is one of the most dangerous teams in college football, right? You take a look at the offensive side of the ball. Bo Nix, Troy Franklin, a phenomenal run game and a loaded wide receiver group. Not many questions about what this Oregon offense is going to look like in 2023. Now, to talk about how this team is so dangerous, if they can take some steps in 2023 on the defensive side of the ball, you're really talking a national title contending team. There are a few stats to start this one out that, it's hard to believe when I read these stats that Oregon was a bona fide top 10 team in the country last year, right? You're taking a look at a 3.27% sack rate. That is 127th nationally. On third downs, they were 123rd. Yards per play, 100th nationally. With all those numbers on the defensive side of the ball that were really bottom of the barrel in the FBS, this is still a team that was one of the best college football teams in 2022. And I want to dig into this defense and how they can take a step in 2023. Now, before we do, just want to say thank you to you guys. It's been a blast going deep into these teams. We talked a lot of Oregon football on the recruiting trail. Y'all have shown a ton of love. So if you do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. But more importantly, let us know in the comment section what you guys are thinking. If you're hearing some buzz around players, that's the best part about doing these, learning from you guys, chopping it up in the comment section. So appreciate y'all rocking with the fellas like you do. And Dill, I'm going to kick it off to you. This Oregon defense in 2023, how does it take that step?
It starts and stops with this defensive line and just being able to get some pressure on quarterbacks. So again, their secondary took a beating, and they took the brunt of it last year for why things went poorly in Eugene. But, man, when you hear those pass rush rates, those aren't even close enough. You get not even in the ballpark. And it's stunning coming from Dan Lanning, who's a guy who, when you think Dan Lanning, you think constant pressure, putting teams on their heels. And that's just not what this defensive line did to football teams last year.
Yeah, that was kind of it. This is partially like we talk about learning from you guys. We talked about this Oregon team and highlighted some problems we saw in the defense. And a lot of it had to do with the secondary. Like, some of these numbers for the secondary are flat out bad. And we had some people say in the comment section, like, hey, the pass rush was the problem. Like, the secondary, yeah, it's not elite. But what was really hurting us is just the inability to get to the quarterback. Went back in, watched some games back. And, you see that, and you see it in a big way. This team struggled to manufacture any pressure with their front four. When they did, they really had to send Noah Sewell, Blitzen, or Justin Flo, whoever the linebackers. They had to send linebackers to help that out. Before we get into the personnel of this team, I kind of want to have the conversation about year one coordinators coming to coach getting the head coach job and the struggles that defensive coordinators have, right? We talk about offense, and it's really easy if you're an offensive-minded head coach to come in, implement your scheme, and have year one success. If you're a defensive coach, that gets a little bit harder because we talk about defense having a lot more to do with the personnel. Like the Jimmies and the Joes, not really the X's and the O's.
But defense is also like a big team part. Like, it's like legit team sport on defense. When you have a really good quarterback and a good offensive coordinator, you can kind of fill up, okay, like maybe your offensive line's not good, maybe the running game's not good. But if your quarterback can play and you have a wideout or two and a smart offensive coordinator, you can probably make it work. It's just when you get to the defense, it's a culture thing.
And you need the guys. And you look at a lot of defensive coordinators who took head coaching jobs. Brent Venables, year one with Oklahoma, that was really rocky. Even going back to Kirby Smart taking the job at Georgia, he struggled his year one on defense with Georgia. So I think there's reason to be optimistic that Dan Lanning is now going into year two. He spent 18 months with these guys, and he's recruited some of them out of the transfer portal. He's recruited some of them out of high school. I think you're going to see just a little bit more of a development, and that yet alone, I think, is a reason to be optimistic to take a step. Now, I do want to start with the defensive line, because if this unit does get better, it needs to get better rushing the passer. And some guys, I like what this personnel is. Like, you talk Jordan Burch, Brandon Dorless. I like some of those guys they have. How are they stepping up in 2023?
And that's going to be the question, because, on the surface, I'm a little surprised they didn't take 2 or 3 more guys out of the portal, given how weak the play was.
Dan Lanning likes what he got.
That maybe makes you think, man, Lanning maybe sees something in a guy like Dorless or a guy like Casey Rogers. Both guys who honestly had their moments of good football.
Casey Rogers was a freak towards the end of the year for Oregon, by the way.
Just, again, the consistency wasn't there at times. And and you got to maybe Lanning was figuring out how to use them because these guys are a little special in how you use them. I mean, Brandon Dorlus is not a pure edge rusher. He's not going to play like a Von Miller or some of these elite guys coming off the edge. He is a powerful player. He probably play that 3-tech. He can rush anywhere across the line. And same goes for Jordan Birch, frankly, and probably Mateo Ewan as he's coming in. They're just bigger, heavier defensive linemen in it, or defensive ends, I should say. And it'll be interesting to see. Maybe like Dan Lanning and company, we're just figuring out how to get the most out of them and put them in positions to win. Because again, they kind of have specific skill sets.
Yeah, and if there's anyone I trust to make that happen and like figure out how to use like elite guys on the defensive line, it's Dan Lanning, and especially from a development standpoint. Now, one thing I'll say is Dan Lanning has a really good track record with some of those heavier-handed guys. You mentioned, like, they're not really the bursty, bendy guys. They're more speed to power. I'm going to go right through tackles, collapse pockets. You look at like guys like Trayvon Walker, Robert Beal from Georgia, guys that Dan Lanning developed. He's had some success with more of the heavy-handed edge rushers. So there's a lot of reasons to be optimistic about Jordan Birch, Brandon Dorlus, and even Mateo Yu coming in as a year one dude to kind of get some pass rush. And that's the key. Like, if they don't get better rushing the passer with this front four, like it's just gone. It's hard to see this Oregon team taking massive steps.
Be disruptive. Like, you don't need necessarily sack numbers to be off the wall, but they got to be able to push pockets and collapse and make quarterbacks feel uncomfortable in a way it never felt like they were able to do much last year. Where teams, again, you look at that Washington game, that's not a great offensive line. It's a solid offensive line, but you got to make a guy like Penix feel uncomfortable for much of it, and that they just couldn't do it. And again, I'm not looking at sacks. I'm looking at, can they be disruptive? Can they push pockets? And again, do those things that just gets people off their spot, if you will.
Do that thing that he did at Georgia. Do the things that made Georgia so elite, was like making guys feel uncomfortable, being super disruptive on defense. Now, working towards the back end of this defense, I think on paper and what a lot of the national media will say is it got worse, right? You lose Noah Sewell to the NFL draft. You lose former 5-star to Justin Flo to Arizona. You lose Christian Gonzalez to the NFL. A lot of, I wouldn't say casuals, but maybe if you didn't take a deep dive into Oregon, you're saying, okay, this group's going to take a step back. They just lost a first rounder and they lost an NFL draft pick at linebacker. Dill, I think this linebacker group specifically gets substantially better in 2023.
And it was just a disappointing unit last year. And I don't totally get why. Again, you probably point to Noah Sewell just not being totally designed for this system and playing in space, because he's a linebacker you kind of want inside the box. And that's just
Noah Sewell should have been playing defensive line.
That's not how the Pac-12 makes you play on linebackers. So again, you look at what they're doing now. Justin Jacobs, long athletic linebacker. Jeffrey Bossa, more athletic. And then kicking Jamal Hill down to play linebacker from safety, athletic. I think they're just going to change that. I don't know, just the personnel to, like, again, what they need to do against a team like UCLA, who's going to be spreading you out and running you across the field. It's having athletic, rangy linebackers, which looks like what they're more going to have this year than when you.
Yeah, these like that's not. I mean, Justin Flo, that's a knock. Justin Flo, respectfully, just didn't really you could tell he was kind of clueless out there, just like kind of running with it like a chicken with his head cut off. Noah Sewell, he's not a bad linebacker. You mentioned it best. He's not the best linebacker to be in the Pac-12 in terms of what you're going to be asked to do. Said it best. Like, you have some of the more athletic, rangier backers. I think that unit takes a step forward, even though you lose a guy like Noah Sewell. Working towards the back end, a group that when you get back into the film, like, it wasn't as bad as you thought, right? It really was these quarterbacks having all day to throw. And if you could have an all-Americans across the board in the secondary, if you can't get after the passer, it's going to be hard for those cornerbacks and safeties to stick with guys. I like what they did in terms of you have some young talent like a Jaleel Florence. I really like Dante Manning is supposedly going to take that step now. But what you did is you go out in the transfer portal and go get a bunch of veteran guys, right? Tasheem Johnson, one of our favorite dudes coming from Ole Miss, just an absolute bruiser. But then Evan Williams. You look across the FBS, I don't think you can find many safeties that have played as much football, that have played as much productive football as Evan Williams. And I really like how you kind of just like plugged some of those gaps in the secondary with some veterans in the transfer portal.
And again, I think you're keeping guys who could play. I thought Addison was really good last year. I thought Bridges was solid.
Yes.
Jaleel Florence coming up as a young guy, solid. But you're right. You do add some experience that hopefully cuts down on some of the big plays, because that was another issue they had, was giving up some of the big ones, especially you look at that Washington game, a lot of big plays and certainly too many. And again, you put two guys in the back end who have played as much football as those two have. You got to think that tightens up a little bit.
One guy I forgot to mention, and you talk about Justin Jacobs being you make this guy in a laboratory in terms of the frame that Justin Jacobs has. That's what you want a linebacker to look like. Kyrie Jackson coming over from Alabama. Like, Dan Lanning was recruiting him when he was at Georgia, could come to Georgia. This is a dude that just looks the part, looked really good in the spring game, and not a bad player. Like, you see a lot of transfers who are just like, all right, you couldn't really crack it at your first school, you transfer out. Kyrie Jackson was playing like with guys like Eli Ricks, Kool-Aid McKinstry, both of which Kool-Aid was going to be a top 10 pick in the NFL draft 2024. Eli Ricks was phenomenally talented. Kyrie Jackson can play ball, and he looked really good in the spring game. And I look to him, and I'm not saying he's going to be Christian Gonzalez, but long, fast, good ball skills. Sign me up for that. And Dan Lanning was saying the same thing.
Yeah, and that's just it. It's replacing the positions that they lost at that spot. And again, keeping that kind of unit, I'd say continuous on the cornerback, and then just adding some depth on that back end just to probably limit some of the big plays.
And experience. Yeah, like that's what I love most about it, is like it was a relatively young group last year, and you go out and add a lot of guys who played a lot of football at a high level. And so I guess we'll close it out on, this is a reason that Oregon can truly be special in 2023. I mean, we just went through this defense and kind of gave, I would hope, decent reasons. I don't know. You guys can be the judge of that. Some reasons where Oregon can get much better than they were in 2022 on defense. And if that offense stays intact, which I certainly think it will, with Bo Nix coming into year 2 with the loaded wide receiver groups, and some of these numbers get just a little bit better, this was a top 10 team last year. This could be one of the best teams in the country this year if they figure it out on defense. And I'll tell you one thing to close it out on. There is not a guy in the country I trust more to do that than Dan Lanning going into year 2 with the Oregon Ducks. Appreciate you guys rocking with the boys as usual. If you do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. More importantly, let us know in the comment section what you guys think. Appreciate y'all tuning in, and we'll talk to y'all later.